Chad's specialty is German history. He wrote the book Naked Germany, Health, Race, and Nation, wrote 10 book reviews, and made 18 professional presentations. He was an 18-time recipient of, quote, the person who made the most significant positive contribution to his or her education award at East Carolina University. And he received a Star Faculty nomination at East Carolina University in 2015. Chad's presentation today is titled Veggie Tales. Chad?
Well, thank you very much. I had no idea that all of those things were going to make it into your introduction. Before I got serious about my education, I taught at East Carolina. Now that I'm serious about it, I'm here at Wesley.
A good move, we're grateful.
It was a great move. I've never been happier, so thank you all very much. I want to say something. I had this kind of internal conflict about this paper for a while, because it is a project that I'm kind of working on, but it's also something I wanted to speak to you as non-historians, since there's presumably only one other historian in the room. And it kept being pulled in both directions at the same time, so there may be things that don't necessarily, that only he understands because of the language. So if that happens, just please feel free to say what, and I'll back up. For those of you who aren't historians, and thank you for coming, I want to say something at the first about how we tend to think of ourselves as historians, which is to say we generally say what our approach is, and then we usually give our century and then our country. It's a stupid way of organizing ourselves, but it's what we do. So for example, I would say I'm a social historian of 19th century Germany. I asked him before we came, Dr. Saris says he's a social historian of the 19th century United States South. So with that in mind, as social historians do, I decided some time ago to ask myself to see if I could write a history of social class from the point of view of food. And I wondered if, based on what people ate, or what we could identify as what people ate, we could determine anything specific about their class or their lives in that class, as we can do with clothing, right? Depending on your hat or your coat or whatever. I immediately discovered two small things and one really big thing. Number one, a previous generation of historians, brave and persistent and, from my perspective, heroic, established statistically, without the aid of computers, because this was the 60s and 70s, with statistical precision, the amount and kinds of calories that the working classes were eating in the 1870s, 80s, and early 1900s. Again, the heroic age of calculations. Number two, and this is still a small thing, determining social class based on what people ate is possible, but it's deeply, deeply fraught with problems. Contemporary workers, or contemporary sources, I should say, who left writings behind, speak consistently of hunger, of tight budgets, and infrequent access to meat. However, historians' statistics indicate that's not true. Who are you going to believe? The people who were there, the people who have given them numbers? I don't know. I might not be able to write a history of social class from the perspective of food, but I decided I could use food to understand more broadly some of the social fabric of 19th century Germany in a very primal way. To put it slightly differently, I now ask not what or how much food your class ate, but what your class said about your food, said about your class. You'll see. This is the big one. This is number 3. Sometime in the mid-19th century, due not necessarily to related causes, food itself became simultaneously more scienticized and homeopathicized. And I'm not sure if those are antipodes or not, but for my purposes they'll have to be. Food has retained these arguably divergent scientific and homeopathic aspects ever since. I'm not exactly sure what this means for my project. Is it still about using food to understand and reconstruct the social class from the 19th century? Or is it more a project that uses food to understand the gradual rationalization of European societies or German society? Or is it, like food itself, an unholy combination of the two? I don't know. But you get to be here at the birth. First, some background on the 19th century and on food in the 19th century. The 19th century is the century when economic and social structures that had held sway for centuries were disappearing under the arrival of market capitalism and especially industrialization and the factories that come with it. What was replacing the old ways was still being formed, and it was still not fully known to contemporaries, and it was certainly not understood by any of them. Maybe Karl Marx, but not many others. It was a seismic change, and even that seismic change was something that contemporaries, regardless of where they were on the class scale, could and did realize. And so for more on the 19th century, I say, take my class. I've got a whole semester of it. I couldn't resist since registration's coming up. At the same time, and partly for the same reasons, food also began to undergo a profound and deep transformation. And this was no simple transformation. Food became the subject of science, it became the product of industry, it became the object of reformers, it became the worry of moralists, it became the hope of utopians, and it is the topic of a debate we are still having today. And to be sure, food had always been a matter of concern, and the concern had always been about supply, or chiefly about supply. Historically speaking, everyone had worried about food supply. King and beggar, farmer and merchant had for centuries nervously watched the harvest, wondering, hoping it would be enough. The bread riot had once upon a time been the single most common type of civil disorder. By the mid-19th century, worries about the dearth of food were becoming a thing of the past. Bread riots completely disappeared from the European street. No one would have known this at the time, but the infamous famines of the 1840s, known sort of myopically as Black 47 if you're Irish, or the potato famine if you're the rest of us, these were the last peacetime famines in European history, and then I always feel like saying, so far, you never know. After mid-century, in Europe, famines were only man-made. They were never again natural. They were the product of warfare or government policy in the 20th century. After mid-century, Europeans were entering a time of food plenty, if not yet quite food excess. So, from the scientific perspective, the great transformation of food occurred when the German scientist Justus von Liebig, having virtually invented the field of organic chemistry, fan of your fan, maybe. There he is. He began to crack the chemical code of food. Liebig realized that organisms, whether plant or animal, needed salts, proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and so forth to live. Suddenly, determining how much of each substance an organism needed was possible, and it was urgent. In the years 1840 to 1880 saw his students, who are the towering scientific names of their day, busily deciphering the secrets of nutrition in what today we would recognize as the emerging science of nutrition, or if you're fancier, dietetics. From that moment to this one, we are still looking for the answer to how much protein, from what source, plant or animal, for how much fat, for how many carbohydrates are necessary for humans to function at peak performance. And the boogeyman changes over time. Here it's salt, there it's sugar, but the question is still something that we look for. I was thinking of the food calorie packaging that Congress mandated. It's got this many calories in it, and then we didn't pay any attention to that, so they said, make it bigger, so we made it bigger, and list all the bad things for you. In the beginning, protein dominated early efforts to nourish the masses. And underscoring the earlier link, and by earlier I mean in the 19th century, between food consumption and social class, the initial concern of contemporaries of men like Mr. von Liebig and others was to make sure the lower classes, the working classes, were getting enough protein. His response to this was to invent meat extract in 1852. two pictures of that. One's from that time and one's from a later time. On the left is the German version. For those of you who like your beef extract in English, here you go. OXO, beef and brief. The idea was, the working classes need protein, let's get it to them in a quick and cheap manner. And although very successful at the time, his Liebig's meat extract found its greatest success as an ingredient in something else, rather than as the outright supplement it was intended. His meat extract, along with more recently discovered wheat starch, quickly became the pillars of the soup and what we might more generally refer to as the convenience food industry. Probably inevitably, but perhaps only inevitably, industrialization of food products followed in the wake of scientific exploration of food. Internationally known firms like Maggi and Knorr, whose products you can even buy across the street at the Food Line in Rocky Mount. Lesser known to American ears, a sort of German Betty Crocker company known as Dr. Oetker. There are 3 logos and some sample products. All get their start in the same time. Knorr you can buy at the grocery stores anywhere. I think Maggi is a little bit more difficult to find in American grocery stores, but you can still do it in Eastern North Carolina if you like. Dr. Oetker is practically impossible to find in Eastern North Carolina. I have done it, but it's much more of a Betty Crocker type thing. Cakes and cookies and mixes and so forth. It's good enough. However, tentatively, food preparation was leaving the kitchen in the 1850s and 60s, and it was beginning in a factory. To be sure, soups were still made at home, but the process of making that soup was begun with a soup starter. It's not entirely from scratch anymore. This is the first step to the microwave dinner. One path to our modern understanding of food originates in science. It is animated by the genuine concerns for our fellow hungry humans, and it leads through industry to our own kitchen table. This path tells us very little about the society that invented and embraced these changes. It tells us that that society was working more. It tells us that that society was working more away from home. It tells us that that society's members, and probably truthfully, were not eating enough. The scientific path, I think above all else, represents the hope of a more efficient society, maybe even a more efficient body. In the 20th century, food experts and scientists and nutritionists and government policymakers would all tap into the promise of understanding food from its chemistry. Here, the understanding of food speaks to the utopian goal of feeding people just the right things in just the right amounts to guarantee a sort of maximum health or performance. I wouldn't be overweight if I ate as I'm supposed to. Think of this as you are what you eat in terms of chemical elements as they translate into performance or work, the periodic table of eating. In the darkness of the 20th century, though, this scientific approach to food knowledge was applied by governments to keep the war effort going in the First World War. Much more darkly still, it was used by Nazi scientists to calculate precisely the barest minimum of elements, mineral supplements, calcium or magnesium or whatever, that they could feed their East European slaves per ton of coal they needed extracted from the ground by those slaves. It's not even food, it's the chemical supplement. This is getting ahead of myself. The second path to our, what I say is our complicated modern understanding of food, is to focus on it as an agent of our physical and moral well-being. And here what a person eats determines that person's health, his or her, and in the 19th century it's almost always a his. I'm sure women did these things too. They're impossible to find in the literature for a variety of reasons. You morally are From the point of view of the historian, of me, this is a much more fruitful path of discovery. If wanting to uncover what the men and women of a particular class believed was good or bad or moral or immoral, positive or negative, nothing is better than layering onto food the outcomes that you want. Not surprisingly, vegetarians blazed the trail in terms of arguments for better, healthier, and more moral living through food consumption. I'm aware there are vegetarians in the audience. Intentional or purposeful vegetarianism has been part of European culture in one form or another since the time of the ancient Greeks. Each age has chosen to eschew meat for its own peculiar reasons. These reasons in turn offer a direct look at what animated the fears and concerns of the particular age at both an individual level and on a broader social plane. As individuals, 19th century Germans who turned to vegetarianism, for example, did so overwhelmingly out of concerns for their own health. At least that's what they said in their writing. There are possible other reasons. Viewed as a movement that spanned several decades, however, vegetarianism addressed a deeper set of anxieties about the emerging modern social order. And I think, and this is what I'm going to say next in the paper, is that vegetarianism promised to constrain the one force that underpinned all of the other fears, concerns, and anxieties of the day, and that is sex. 19th century vegetarianism, like everything else, has its own antecedents. Mid-century vegetarians drew very heavily from the practices and ideas of the cure rituals of an earlier generation, especially those of Vincent Priesnitz and Johann Schrock, and I realize I'm probably the only person who speaks German, but it's fun to say in the audience. This is Mr. Priesnitz on the left, and this is an example of his cure regimens, and I'll say something about that. This is 4 men pouring probably cold water over a patient to reduce his fever. It says the fever reducing half bath in the German below. These men, Priesnitz and Schrock, both maintained naturopathic cure installations. They developed elaborate healing methods and rituals which were themselves rooted in the properties of nature. The idea of naturopathy is that you use the elements of nature to bring cures to people. It looks like a bunch of, I would never reduce a fever under a certain temperature by doing this, but the influence of these kinds of healthcare systems is evident. They might use light or air or sweating. The influence of these healthcare systems is evident in the manner in which vegetarian authors always presented their vegetarianism as a method to achieve good health or to avoid illness. Another vegetarian, Theodor Hahn, included vegetarianism as part of a, and this is his quote, natural healing lesson, and as a new healing principle. It was for health. Eduard Balzer, whom you'll see later on, presented vegetarianism as a component of a, quote, natural life way and a, quote, path to health. And vegetarianism in the 19th century, at least, and I would argue it continues today, at least among the Germans, never lost its naturopathic influence. It does privilege diet over the many other living conditions, which would be air, light, clothing, living space, believed necessary to create and to maintain a healthy body. Quote, the most important element from which a human lives is, however, food and drink, observed Heinrich Lahmann. Vegetarians transformed food itself into an agent that healed or caused harm, which in turn reveals the very strong homeopathic strain in vegetarianism. It reveals in their ideas about food and its consequences. What food one ate bore a direct causal relationship to one's overall fitness and health, or complete and total lack of fitness and health. And however straightforward this is, considerable confusion reigned over just what food was acceptable and created good health. And for those of you who aren't homeopaths, the basic idea, I'm told it's a pseudoscience, the basic idea is that which would cause symptoms in a normal person would cause cure in a sick person. So for cholera, you would take antibiotics, you would give the patient diuretics. You know anything about cholera, that would be a death sentence, because it's a diuretic already. But that's what they say. Generally speaking, foods that made Germans healthy were those that were grown in the soil and which had not undergone any kind of transformative process. This, above all else, means fermentation. So, for example, and they said this, sourdough bread, authors pointed out, was only alcohol in a slightly different form. Theodor Hahn noted that food needed to meet 3 criteria to be useful. It had to be nutritious, it had to be digestible, not simply just taste good and be something you could chew and be able to digest it. And number 3, it must not cause harm to the senses. Of these 3, the last one was without question the most important. Bread possessed healing properties that transcended one's own diet. It mended social ills, and it was universally recommended by vegetarians. The experience of eating bread, and this is a quote, would bring poor and rich closer together, make it easier for each side to walk in the other's shoes. Imagine that. Like their scientific food counterparts in the 20th century, 19th century vegetarians were utopians. Many authors believed that vegetarianism would solve the social problem of the day, which for them was the yawning gap between the working class, between the poor, and everyone else. Unlike the 20th century food utopians, 19th century men did not entertain ideas of minimum nutrient, caloric, and mineral intake to slave labor extraction. Generally speaking, these men, the 19th century food utopian, was a vegetarian whose outlines for happy social relations did not go beyond, we should just all eat the same bread together. Somehow that would do it. They never elaborated. Just all eating rye bread filled with seeds. For Edward Balzer, good food was any that did not interfere with our instinct, or alternately, which contributed to the re-establishment of our natural instinct. Examples of these foods might be fruits and cereals, breads with bran, mother's milk, but not cow's milk. Not necessarily cow's milk. He explains that such foods are healthy for people, primarily because of their relationship to human nature. Each species needed its own food, just as each plant needed its own native soil, its own climate to thrive. And for both Hahn and Balzer, peas, beans, lentils, and fruit were good for people. Hahn emphasized lettuce, especially for those who were attempting to mitigate the effects of meat. Balzer stated that vegetables are beneficial. That was it. Hahn took a more precise view. He prescribed root vegetables as either poisonous, like the potato, or dangerous to one's blood and kidneys, which is the whole family of leeks, which is easier to discern in the German because the word Lauch appears at the ends of all the words, but there would be things like actual leeks, or garlic, or many of the things you eat from the onion family are all related. I hope there's nothing biased. Variety is not something these guys are interested in. It is not a gustatory concern. Now, however monotonous the acceptable foods were, the net effect was totally worth it. Vegetarian authors always presented their vegetarianism couched in the language of morality and health. They argued, on the whole, that vegetarians smelled better and excreted a more pleasant odor. Some postulated that world peace would follow mass vegetarianism, because once people stopped slaughtering animals and distanced themselves from blood and murder of animals, they would stop killing each other in wartime. Don't tell Hitler, who was also a vegetarian, but as I learned at a conference once upon a time when I, with some cheek, said that, a very angry man from India jumped up and said, "But he didn't drink his own urine, he couldn't have been one, Mahatma Gandhi was." So, take that under advisement. Edward Balzer, a vegetarian, promised, quote, "the happiest body, soul, and intellect, increased strength and beauty." Following a natural diet, the eater would see, quote, and I love this list, "melancholy, annoyance, dissatisfaction, anger, etc., sluggishness, laziness, dullness, etc., carelessness, forgetfulness, lust, doubt, etc., wrath, crudeness, etc., all fall away." The formula was simple: sticking to a diet limited to peas, lentils, bread, and fruit, German presumably, would find happiness, joyfulness, a desire to work, strength, and courage. The right food improved one's health and outlook. A proper vegetarian diet kept the blood correctly mixed, and therefore prevented all disease. Vegetarians repeatedly promised class harmony. They seldom demonstrated how this would be achieved beyond eating a certain kind of bread together. The wrong foods, and there were a lot more of them than there were good foods, were the wrong foods because they caused stimulation. You see what this is Edward Balzer and his vegetarian cookbook, and he wrote more than one. German vegetarians were keen to avoid an enormous array of foods and beverages out of fear of becoming stimulated. Liquid stimulants like coffee and tea and chocolate affected the stomach, the kidneys, the blood, the nerves, and caused sleeplessness, and they awakened a desire for eating. All forms of alcohol were universally condemned for their stimulating effects on the consumer. Salt, sugar, honey, syrup, fat, butter, and oils, cheese, all stimulated the body or damaged its organs. Sugar innervated the tongue and abnormally stimulated the stomach. Honey was much worse. Cheese was practically meat. Spices, in particular black pepper, vanilla, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, nettles, and mustard, were dangerous to a body and a person. They caused excitability. Eggs, and it goes almost without saying meat, were condemned for a number of economic, environmental, and health reasons. And I was surprised in the literature how many of the arguments we make for vegetarianism today, including it's so much more efficient if you don't feed the cow and then eat the cow. You'll save resources if you leave the cow out and just eat resources. For the same reasons they were recommending, the same environmental and economic reasons, leave the cow out of it, just eat the vegetables yourselves. It is not readily apparent from the works of the mid-century authors why food stimulants, which have their own special name in German, and include things like tobacco and narcotics, it's not exactly clear why they were so dangerous and had to be denied. Aside from the immediate negative effects on the body, these authors and those who later repeated their arguments, and they get repeated over and over and over, give little reason. The bulk of vegetarians' arguments center on the promise of good health, of not falling ill at all, which are important concerns in the pre-antibiotic age. And it's certainly one that would carry a wide appeal. However, being unstimulated by food and drink meant something much more than not falling ill. It meant maintaining one's self-control, and especially sexual self-control. In addition to the many, many harmful effects they caused, stimulant foods were the first part of a process that invariably ended up in sexual awakening. The list is great. Black pepper, cinnamon, vanilla, cloves, nutmeg, all originated in hot tropical climates, making them both too hot for Germans, but at the same time too appealing to say no to. Ultimately, these spices fostered thirst. Thirst the tavern keeper was all too happy to slake, which explained exactly why these precise spices could be found in such abundance in the public houses of the day. Alcohol, of course, led straight to sex. For similar reasons, though, coffee and tea were to be avoided. This is a quote from the turn-of-the-century vegetarian. A fully reasonable person must therefore take notice of the evidence before him and take away from his children these nerve-stimulating drinks that only serve to awaken prematurely their sexual lives. Meat consumption, too, caused a thirst for alcohol. Spices were also sexually stimulating agents. They aroused the passions. Meat was an especially sexually stimulating food agent. Balzer noted the meat diet seduced one to gluttony, to an early sex life, and ultimately, an early death. That's where early sex lives always end up. There's no other place. And I feel it necessary to insert at this point a non-vegetarian voice, because it kind of sounds fun. These things, cinnamon. On the connection of uncontrolled sex and sexual urges to food, at least one rather serious man of science, Robert Virchow, who will be known to the biologists as one of the founders of bacteriology. Robert Virchow also suspected that there was a link between some foods and sexual incontinence. In investigating a regional famine in some backwater called the Speiseart, what struck him first on his arrival there were the large numbers of illegitimate children. He also noticed that large numbers of people were sharing houses and rooms and beds. He was pretty sure that these were the major contributing factors to the region's illegitimacy. Then he leaves this tantalizing sentence that suggests there might be something else. Since so many people were living and sharing bed space, he writes, quote, "It isn't necessary then to search for yet another source of stimulation in the potato, although such a direct sexual stimulant can also not be ruled out. And the potato is the classic food of the poor. You can grow a lot of it in a little space and feed a lot of people. It might be the reason. Either tight quarters and bed sharing caused the region's illegitimacy, or it was the potato. The emergence of vegetarianism as a healthcare system in the mid-19th century should be questioned, examined. An easy interpretation, and not necessarily a false one, would be to suggest that it was a response to the infectious perils of the age. However, the elaborate systems, the connections to moral behavior, the promises of social healing indicate more. Similarly, following breakthroughs in organic chemistry and the birth of the science of nutrition, food came under a new scrutiny, and reliable efforts to establish nutrients and nutrient values for good health began, and these continue into our own time. Certainly, many authors voiced objections to the scientific jargon and expressed a desire to address every man in their works, and Balzer and his predecessor, Hahn, the book is here, were very good at that. They did not write in scientific language. They wrote in a very folksy way, which is their point. Mid-century vegetarianism is not a rejection of science. It is much more than that. Vegetarian authors did acknowledge and address the burning controversies of their day about protein, about carbohydrates, and about various other nutrients. How much should you get? Where should you get them from? These guys are not scientists. They're like us, right? I couldn't find the right words. It's not one of these. Vegetarians appear very happy to participate in these debates. They're not as learned, right? Their responses aren't scientific, but they're not simply rejecting the encroachment of science into this matter. They have a debate. It's not exactly clear whom the mid-century vegetarians were addressing. Vegetarian authors, Hahn and Balzer, as well as many others, acknowledged, as did the great socialist August Bebel, that workers were already de facto vegetarians. They really couldn't afford meat, or certainly not on any kind of frequent basis. This is something that doesn't seem to have made the working classes any healthier or more sexually continent. And aside from an occasional nod to the working classes, the works by these men do not seem aimed at the workers of the world. Neither is there much to suggest that these works were intended for the middle classes, at least not in the texts themselves. Certainly many of the appeals they made, hard work, self-discipline, moderation, these sound like classic bourgeois values. In the American historical context, Sylvester Graham, known to many of us as the guy who invented graham crackers, in fact promoted celibacy through foodstuffs at a time of expanding democracy and the transition to market capitalist economy, the celebrated era of Jacksonian democracy. For what it's worth, he invented a bread. It was graham bread that, in its long journey to us and campfires and s'mores, became graham crackers. But its intention was to reduce sexual interest. The decline of traditional manufacturing in the American 1830s and 40s and its familiar social structure, the simultaneous sharp rise in population, especially of illegitimacy, cheap and easy access to alcohol, even a rising standard of living, may all have contributed to a sense of unease and trepidation about the contemporary present and the upcoming future that resulted in focusing on one's own agency in this very changing world. The German world at mid-century, 1850s and 60s and beyond, is seldom considered a place of expanding capital and democratic freedom. It may be time for reassessing that. And just one distant observation, all American men receive on paper the right to vote with the passage of the Civil War amendments at about the same time that universal manhood suffrage arrives in Germany in the 1860s. Thank you for your time. Anything you want to ask, I'm happy to make an effort to answer. Gentleman in the back.
Do you know anything about how vegetarianism in Germany has progressed since the 19th century? Has it increased or decreased over time? And has it contributed to the health or not contributed to the health of?
So many good questions. Vegetarianism in Germany, and I didn't put that in here, is part of a much, in the 19th century, part of a much larger, very fractious, sectarian, loose movement known as life reform, under which everything you can imagine is housed. And it is a very powerful underground force that dominates German society. You would never see it from the street. To a certain extent, there are some vegetarian shopping stores that are a chain. They're called reform houses that are, you can find all over Germany. But in terms of what Germans do and how they act and how they view food and certain kinds of behavior, this life reform movement dominates public life. And vegetarianism is very much a part of that. Some time ago, there was a very good piece on, not too far ago, a very good piece on NPR about Berlin being a vegetarian's dream. There are so many vegetarian restaurants all over the place in Berlin. Germans are fantastic vegetarians, which is impressive for the land of pork that it is. Having said that, not too long after that article about Berlin being a great place for vegetarians to live, the German government released a report saying vegetarianism is not a healthy lifestyle and you should knock it off immediately. So, but it dominates how Germans behave, even though the one German vegetarian I ever met took me to dinner at a Yugoslavian restaurant where she ordered a 9-kilogram meat dish. As the vegetarian, it wasn't for me. I got one too, but yes, sir.
So where did they get the idea that it was healthier?
You'll get this. I said this to somebody recently and they looked at me funny. The life reform that I talked about fractures like 17th century English Protestantism. And if you follow it long enough, my thinking is you'll find the Martin Luther or the Jesus at the end of the day that started the whole thing, right? So I started with this question about food, and it led me to vegetarianism. And as I spent more time with the vegetarians, it went from Balzer and a few others to Hahn. And this book is not technically a vegetarian book. It is the house doctor. Letters. It's fine. It's a homeopathic book about homeopathic cures, about a third of which is devoted to food and its effects on the person and the body. The thing is he organized his book exactly like the man and in the same order as the man who invented homeopathy in the 1700s, whose book I haven't been able to get yet. We're working on it, right? And that's why I think they get this idea, the idea that what you put in you causes an immediate effect on you, be it dizziness or excitability or sleepiness, whatever it is, hard work. I think this is the transition figure from that earlier romantic, late Enlightenment view of elements as having an effect on you in a quasi-medical way to, well, food does too. I mean, and caffeine does. We can't not pretend that that's the case. Or red dye 86 if you're my second daughter. Things like that. Does that kind of...
And it's just interesting that they would be so specific about what does what. And you said that they're not anti-scientific, they respect science, and yet they make these very specific claims without any actual scientific evidence to support them.
And this is, however, and it's a good point, this is the age, though, when you might say modern chemistry is being invented. Right? It's the same 1840s, 50s, and 60s. But you're right, they're not, I was expecting them to say, yeah, science, science. That's a later generation will, when it comes to things like immunizations and bacteria, these strange little beings inside my body here, right? These guys didn't. They were happy to say, oh, you think it's 100 grams of protein? I think it's 95. And they would go on for pages and pages, and these elaborate charts, and it's really daunting to try to get through it all. People don't care. But they very easily connected it to food and sort of behavior. Yes, sir.
You said they said that potatoes lead to premature sexual interactions, so does that mean we should stop eating like French fries and peanut?
I'm giving this whole report to the cat. You're going to see nothing but peas and lentils. I think they figured it out, but potatoes probably weren't. It was probably the wrong way of looking at it. Here's a bunch of poor people, here's a bunch of illegitimate kids. God, they sure eat a lot of potatoes. No, they eat a lot of potatoes because they don't have any land, and you can grow a lot of potatoes in a little bit amount of land and feed a lot of people. That's not why they were finding things to do other than work in the fields all day. So I think your French fries are safe.
Okay.
And tater tots and everything else. Oh, yes, ma'am.
You know, when you start talking about this era, I'm thinking of the things you read about. The kings and princes would have these dinners that would be 7 or 9 courses, and there would be meat and fish and fat. Was there any discussion about the difference between the rich and the poor and what they could afford or in their health as a result? I mean,
It's a good question. It's the thing that I haven't uncovered. My suspicion is Hahn and Balzer, who may have been Swiss, were not working class, but they are not upper class. I can't prove that they're in the middle class, but in terms of relationship to work and money and income and so on and so forth. My suspicion is that meat eating was more heavily associated with the aristocracy of the day. Profligate, sexually wanton layabouts who soaked up the labor of the field hands. You certainly don't want to imitate them. So you don't eat meat. At the same time, you want to separate yourself from them by demonstrating your hard work or your moral rectitude or whatever it is. Well, if the poor have too many kids because they eat potatoes, the rich are sexually profligate because they eat too much meat. Let's cut both of those out and introduce only these sort of proper food. I haven't seen anyone say that yet, and it would be something that I would need to find, but my gut tells me that. They did not necessarily look upon the upper classes with any kind of affection. But I can't prove it. Just a suspicion. Yes, ma'am.
So this is like pre our current era of if you're vegetarian, you're eating a lot of tofu. So like, how are they getting their protein? I know you talked about beans and lentils. Is it like an overwhelming amount of beans and lentils, or do they consider fish to be meat?
No, one of them actually considers fish to be worse than actual beef or pork. It is sex. I don't know why he said that, because what they sort of do is if you know what aphorisms are, this book in particular is sort of written in an aphoristic style. He'll have a headline and then he'll just sort of have a list of cause and effect from peas or fish or whatever. One thing I haven't been able to read are their cookbooks. For example, this Walters, this is a cookbook. I would love to read the recipes. It's probably a lot of nuts, but I just haven't been able to get my hands on one yet. And one way I thought about going about this too was looking at what were the most popular cookbooks of the day that say you would have served your family from if you were a middle-class housefrau or something like that. The problem with cookbooks is, I've got 10, I use 3 recipes from each. I've got 900 pages of unused recipes on my shelves. If I were to come back in 200 years, wow, these guys, they eat a lot of fish. I opened the fish section of my cookbook. So it's not necessarily a fruitful way of going about it, but it does give you some idea. And it doesn't factor in things like price or things like that. But their protein would have probably come from nuts or the plant stuff. When they weren't arguing about it. And again, the debate rages across the decades. One guy studied Dutch soldiers and thought 100 grams of meat protein was fine, and 97 grams of protein from eggs, and another guy came back and said, oh, you're out of your mind, you can't have 97 grams of eggs, it's 37 grams of eggs. What are you doing to these soldiers? They can't kill 37 grams of eggs in their system. Yes, ma'am.
It's a sort of a comment rather than a question.
Please.
But as a person in religious studies, I could not but notice that when you're saying that what you eat is related to your morality, it's a moral question. But there are lots of questions like that in early Judaism and early Christianity, that what you eat is related to your morality. Of course, what you mean by morality is completely different from your discussion.
And they don't define morality either.
That's
they
right.
just say,
Yeah, it was, I think it's on purpose. It was really fluid. But then when I'm thinking about the early Christian, the monks and nuns who started their monasticism in Egypt in 4th century and 5th century, when they were gathering as a group, they were vegetarians. So of course they were really poor, most of them. They gave up all their worldly positions to the poor people, and then they were there to work and pray. But they were poor, but then they were purposefully vegetarian because they wanted to urge their bodily desires, especially sexuality, sexual desire, and all other anger and all things. So they were eating very hard bread in water, and sometimes lentil because they needed some kind of protein, and really occasionally a little bit of chives. So I was thinking about what you were saying was really, it was just similar in some ways, that they wanted to, of course they wanted to keep their body, they wanted to keep the minimum of food. Then, of course, there are Buddhist monks who are not eating all these food, so that they can urge all these bodily urges. So I thought it was very interesting that I don't see there is any religious rhetoric there, but what they were doing was similar in many ways in religious rhetoric, in religious people were doing.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I did leave that one part out, and it's both on accident and on purpose. They don't spend much time on that. However, he in particular points out that Jesus was a vegetarian, and it's It doesn't matter if it's true or not, it's what he thought. And he is the one who says, if you stop sort of soaking yourself in the blood of animals,
Yeah.
we'll have world peace. Which leads to a second kind of religious aspect to this, which is, if you're a German Jew in the 19th century, being a vegetarian is a great way to pass in German society. If you're invited over to someone's house for dinner, you don't have to worry about this pesky meat question or pork question, because you're just going to skip all the meat. Right? Oh, yeah, I'd love to eat your Schweinekoteletten, but it turns out I can only eat carrots today. Right? And that way you might not necessarily have to admit, and there's not many, I mean, it's probably 300,000 or 400,000, but it is a religious component to this larger question. And there is a religious aspect to food that didn't make it into here, and it doesn't make it into much of what they say either. Although, as I get my hands on more sources, it might play a larger role, but I really appreciate that perspective. It's one I hadn't remembered. Thank you for coming. It's fun to be able to do this once in a while.